In the closing winter of 1944, as the Third Reich buckled under the combined weight of Allied offensives, a quieter struggle unfolding behind the front lines. Few today remember that before the CIA existed, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, fought a shadow war across Eastern Europe. Their mission was simple on paper, but perilous in practice. Gather intelligence on German withdrawals, monitor Soviet advances, and extract resistance leaders before Stalin's security apparatus closed its iron fist around the region. Yet among these assignments lies one of the most unsettling threads in American intelligence history: the unexplained disappearance of multiple OSS teams, whose final messages were cut short mid-transmission, and whose fate remains largely obscured by wartime chaos. The struggle for operational access began in Poland, where the Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, still resisted German occupation even as the Red Army neared Warsaw. OSS teams such as Ringbolt and Sloop attempted to reach scattered resistance commanders to coordinate intelligence sharing for the anticipated Allied post-war administration. But everything changed after the Warsaw Uprising collapsed in October 1944. Soviet forces halted outside the city, allowing the Germans to crush the uprising, and leaving OSS and Home Army contacts trapped between retreating Wehrmacht units and the NKVD's rapid-moving counterintelligence detachments. Several OSS officers wrote in their final dispatches that they feared Soviet betrayal more than German capture. In Czechoslovakia, similar operations unfolded through the rugged Carpathian passes. OSS Detachment 100, operating near Banska Bystrica, supported local insurgents during the Slovak National Uprising in late 1944. For weeks, they coordinated airdrops of weapons, including M1 carbines, bazookas, and British-made Sten guns. But as German counteroffensives retook the region, OSS operatives attempted an emergency withdrawal toward Soviet lines. Only fragmentary radio logs survive, mentions of unexpected Soviet patrols, misaligned rendezvous, and one haunting line: "We are not sure who is hunting us anymore." Historical context from OSS diaries paints a grim backdrop. Major William Donovan, OSS founder, issued a directive in early 1945 warning teams in Eastern Europe to avoid unnecessary contact with Soviet commanders, noting growing tensions over post-war territorial control. A Czech partisan courier named Oldrich Marek later recalled meeting an American officer who expressed concerns that the war's next enemy might already be watching us. These remarks, recorded in Marek's notebook, were dismissed at the time as wartime paranoia, yet in hindsight, they reflected the nascent divide between Allied cooperation and Soviet suspicion. The first disturbing reveal came in March 1945, when an OSS communications team in Krakow reported receiving a scrambled distress call from one of the vanished detachments. The signal lasted only seconds, describing pursuit from the east, not the west, an inversion that troubled analysts. After the war, Soviet archives listed no German operations in the area at that time, but NKVD documentation remains conspicuously silent. The possibility that Soviet patrols mistakenly or deliberately intercepted OSS personnel has never been conclusively addressed. The Americans recovered no bodies, no equipment, and no prisoner records, suggesting the teams may have been absorbed into a security system from which few emerged. Modern reflection adds sting to the historical record. Intelligence specialists today note that the OSS's lack of unified command structure and its dependence on local resistance networks made infiltration almost inevitable. Some analysts argue that Soviet counterintelligence units, trained in deep penetration tactics since the 1930s, may have anticipated Allied movements and prepared traps accordingly. If true, it would mean the earliest moves of the Cold War took place not in post-war Berlin or Washington, but in the forests and mountain passes of wartime Eastern Europe, before Germany even surrendered. The closing tension of this chapter emerges from the unanswered questions left behind. U.S. post-war investigations into the missing OSS operatives were quietly closed by 1948, shortly after the CIA's creation, with few details publicly released. Surviving families received vague explanations, citing operational uncertainty, while the internal files remain heavily redacted. To this day, historians debate whether these teams were victims of chaotic frontline conditions, German countermeasures, or the first concealed clash between Western intelligence and the Soviet security state. As we move forward, the legacy of these disappearances will cast a long shadow. The newly formed CIA studied these losses closely in the years immediately following WWII, shaping their earliest Cold War strategies that would soon be tested in the tense and rapidly shifting landscapes of Eastern Europe. In the turbulent years immediately following the end of World War II, Eastern Europe became a vast, shifting battleground, not of armies, but of intelligence services. One little-known fact sets the stage. By 1947, dozens of wartime resistance networks, once supported by the OSS, were now being hunted by the very nation that had been their wartime ally. As the United States formed the Central Intelligence Agency that same year, its first major directive in Eastern Europe was not to confront the remnants of Nazism, but to rescue and reorganize anti-communist elements who feared Soviet occupation. These early CIA operations were rooted directly in the unfinished business of World War II, and their outcomes would shape the Cold War for decades. The struggle began in Hungary and Romania, where the rapid consolidation of Soviet political control created an atmosphere of fear among former resistance fighters, particularly those who had collaborated with British SOE or American OSS units. These men and women had spent years undermining German authority, but now their skills and Western contacts made them targets for Soviet state security. The newly formed CIA inherited fragments of their networks, once used for sabotage and intelligence during the war. Now, those same routes, the safe houses, courier lines, and mountain crossings, were repurposed for exfiltration missions. Yet the task was fraught with challenges. Soviet internal security forces, especially the NKVD and its successors, had learned from their WWII counterintelligence campaigns. They deployed the same methods that once trapped German Abwehr operatives: surveillance teams, code-breaking units, and highly trained interrogators. Former OSS officers who joined the CIA described the environment in Eastern Europe as a tightening vice, where once reliable partisan commanders either disappeared, reappeared under pressure, or turned out to be double agents. A revealing insight comes from a CIA field memo dated late 1947, authored by a former OSS captain working in Budapest. The old resistance files are alive, but every name is a liability. Every contact risks a Soviet shadow. The memo warned headquarters that any attempt to reactivate partisan communication channels must be done with extreme caution. But faced with a growing humanitarian crisis, dozens of resistance leaders seeking escape, the CIA pressed ahead. The first major operation, later referred to internally as Lantern Spire, centered on smuggling high-value individuals across the Hungarian-Austrian border. The CIA relied heavily on knowledge gained during World War II, using forest routes once used to evade German patrols. But this time, it was Soviet border guards, often backed by armored cars and trained canine units who patrolled the frontier. Within weeks, several safe houses were compromised. A courier in Debrecen vanished after leaving with documents. 2 weeks later, the same documents appeared in Soviet interrogation notes, precise down to the page numbers. No trace of the courier was ever found. The reveal came when a captured Hungarian contact, interrogated by a CIA liaison in Vienna after escaping NKVD custody, claimed that Soviet counterintelligence had intercepted radio traffic coming from a transmitter the Americans believed was secure. "They were waiting for you," he repeated, describing Soviet teams that allowed operations to proceed just long enough to map the network. His testimony suggested deep infiltration, but the CIA could not determine whether leaks came from local collaborators
or from within the agency's own hastily assembled post-war ranks.
In applying lessons from these events, modern intelligence experts often highlight the dangerous transition between wartime and post-war strategy. During World War II, American operatives could assume, to an extent, shared interests with Soviet forces. But by 1947, the geopolitical landscape had reversed. The very skills that made OSS teams effective, reliance on local resistance, improvisation, compartmentalized cells, reliabilities against a Soviet system optimized for rooting out dissent. The CIA entered Eastern Europe with World War II methods, but the Soviets fought with Cold War vigilance. This tension deepened as Soviet counterintelligence executed what appeared to be a systematic exposure of Western-supported groups. In Romania, the CIA's attempt to extract former anti-Nazi officers was met with unprecedented speed. Meeting points in Cluj and Brașov were raided within hours of messages being sent. One U.S. officer wrote later in his diary, "We walked into shadows already shaped for us." The diary was declassified decades later, offering a rare emotional window into the uncertainty and fear permeating early CIA operations. The close of this chapter leaves more questions than answers. Internal audits within the CIA raised the possibility that multiple early operations were compromised from the start, not through field errors, but through an unidentified pipeline of information leaks. As the geopolitical vice tightened, the light of true potential flickered, struggling against the metallic compression. And as the agency reconsidered its approach, it turned to another frontier of covert action, one where exile fighters, Baltic forests, and midnight parachute drops would define one of its most haunting failures. A little-known but chilling fact sits at the heart of one of the early CIA's most haunting Cold War failures. Between 1949 and 1954, at least a dozen teams of Baltic exiles were parachuted back into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to rebuild underground networks that had first fought the Germans and then resisted the Soviets. Almost every one of these teams vanished without a trace. Their final radio messages were abrupt, panicked, and cut short mid-sentence. These disappearances were not wartime chaos. They occurred during carefully planned CIA operations based on the same principles the OSS had used in occupied Europe during World War II. But the environment had transformed. The Soviet security state, forged through the brutal crucible of the war, now stood waiting. The struggle of these missions began with the men themselves, veterans of World War II, many of whom had fought against both German and Soviet occupation. They gathered in displaced persons camps in West Germany, where CIA officers recruited them for operations codenamed A-ECOB, A-Baybalt, and A-Equor. The plan seemed simple. Insert trained Baltic partisans back into familiar terrain, re-establish contact with surviving Forest Brothers resistance units, and gather intelligence on Soviet troop deployments. These fighters carried experience, local knowledge, and an unbreakable commitment to freeing their homelands. But they also carried memories of the NKVD's ruthless wartime actions, mass deportations, torture, and executions. Many had seen their families taken to Siberia. The tactical challenge was immense. During World War II, the OSS had dropped operatives behind German lines across Yugoslavia, Poland, and France, often relying on the disarray of the front. But post-war Soviet control was absolute. Border troops in the Baltic republics used German-made MG-42s captured in 1945, now mounted on fixed posts. Checkpoints multiplied. Villages were seeded with paid informants. Entire forests were combed by MVD units trained in counter-partisan warfare. Weather stations logged Allied flights. The Soviets had mastered a skill the Germans never perfected: complete territorial oversight. Insight comes from a CIA training manual prepared for the Baltic teams in 1950. It warned operatives that the Soviets mirror our methods, anticipate our routes, and interrogate with precision. The manual noted Soviet advances in radio direction finding,
techniques refined during the war while tracking German Abwehr units and Polish Home Army cells. One chilling footnote added, "Expect interception within 20 minutes of unscheduled transmission."
Yet despite these warnings, the CIA pressed forward, convinced the Soviets lacked the capability to penetrate exile communities in Germany. This assumption would prove catastrophic. The first reveal of trouble emerged with Mission ACOB/1 in late 1949. The team parachuted into Lithuania under cloud cover, transmitting a brief success signal. Then, silence. Days later, a second team, ACOB/2, jumped into the same region. They too disappeared.
It wasn't until Soviet archives partially opened in the 1990s that researchers uncovered interrogation notes indicating that the MGB had been waiting on the drop zone hours before either plane left West Germany. This meant the operation was compromised from the planning stage.
But even during the time, the CIA sensed cracks forming. In 1951, a team operating under the ACOR program sent a final message. "We see lights. This is not the signal. Something is wrong." The transmission stopped mid-word.
The Soviet version, recorded in declassified reports, claims the team triggered a flare trap, a technique learned from anti-partisan operations during World War II, in which disguised beacons misled resistance fighters into ambushes. The trainees had been warned about such traps, yet the Soviets applied them with a level of sophistication that suggested intimate knowledge of CIA procedures.
Reflection from modern historians underscores the tragedy of these missions. Many believe the operations failed because they relied on wartime assumptions, trusting exile groups that the Soviets had infiltrated as early as 1946, or believing that the cover of night could conceal small aircraft from Soviet radar, which had advanced significantly with post-war German technology. One historian noted, where the OSS had worked in wartime cracks, the CIA tried to work in peacetime concrete.
By 1952, the disappearances reached a horrifying pattern. Every team that landed sent one or two routine messages, then abruptly fell silent. Some broadcasts sounded rehearsed or slightly off, causing CIA linguists to alert headquarters that Soviet-controlled agents might be transmitting under duress. A memo from the era describes these transmissions as uncannily precise, lacking emotional tone. The implication was devastating. The Soviets were running captured operatives in a radio deception campaign, mirroring techniques the Germans once used during World War II's Englandspiel, the game that destroyed entire Dutch resistance networks. The chapter closes with unresolved tension. After 1954, the CIA quietly terminated its Baltic infiltration missions. No bodies were recovered, no graves confirmed. Families received no answers. Soviet files remain incomplete, perhaps intentionally sanitized. What endures is a persistent question. Were these missions doomed solely by Soviet skill, or was there a deeper compromise, a leak, a betrayal, that ensured the teams never had a chance? Ahead lies yet another frontier of clandestine conflict, Czechoslovakia, where safe houses, forest trails, and vanishing couriers would shape the next disturbing chapter in this shadow war. A forgotten episode from the late 1940s reveals just how quickly Czechoslovakia, once a hopeful post-war democracy, became a crucible of early CIA covert operations. Few outside intelligence circles know this. By the spring of 1948, mere weeks after the communist takeover in Prague, the CIA was already running clandestine courier networks out of the Šumava forest along the German border. These networks were built on the remnants of World War II-era resistance routes, once used by the British SOE and Czech partisans to sabotage German infrastructure. But now they served a different purpose, funneling political refugees, gathering intelligence on Soviet advisors, and trying to support the last fragments of anti-communist underground groups attempting to survive beneath a rapidly tightening police state. The struggle for the CIA began with the sudden collapse of Czechoslovakia's fragile democratic coalition in February 1948, when the Communist Party, backed by Soviet pressure, seized control of the government. In the chaos that followed, non-communist politicians, former resistance leaders, and military officers scrambled to escape arrest.
The CIA saw an opportunity to re-establish wartime-style intelligence channels through the Shumava region, a rugged sweep of mountains, valleys, and dense forests that had once sheltered anti-Nazi fighters.
But this time, the enemy was not the Wehrmacht. It was the newly empowered Czechoslovak State Security Service, the STB, advised by Soviet MGB officers seasoned in World War II counterinsurgency.
Operational difficulties mounted almost immediately. During World War II, partisans in the Shumava relied on shifting German patrol schedules and sympathetic local villagers.
But in 1948, the new communist authorities fortified the border with layers of barbed wire, concealed observation posts, and patrols equipped with captured German MP-40 submachine guns. Villagers were pressured into cooperation, and the STB began introducing double agents into exile communities in Bavaria. Still, the CIA proceeded with a plan codenamed Operation Baltic String, hoping to re-establish wartime courier lines to Prague and Pelzen. Insight into these early missions comes from the memoir of a former Czech airman, Karl Novak, who had flown with the RAF during World War II and later worked as a CIA courier. He described nighttime crossings through the Shumava. The trees whispered like old comrades. We had used these paths when Germans hunted us. Now the forests felt changed, watched. Novak's notes, later declassified, highlight a common sentiment among early operatives, an eerie sense that the enemy already anticipated their moves. The first reveal of trouble surfaced with the disappearance of a courier named Václav Venca Dolezal in late 1948. Dolezal had carried encoded messages intended for a group of Prague journalists resisting the new regime. He vanished between the towns of Kaspersky Hory and Nirsko, an area heavily used during World War II for partisan movement. Weeks later, the same coded phrases he was carrying appeared almost word for word in STB interrogation transcripts. The STB insisted they found the documents during a routine border sweep, but CIA officers reviewing the case suspected something far more troubling. Either Dolezal had been intercepted with precision, or someone within the courier network had alerted the STB. The situation darkened further in early 1949, when another courier route was compromised. A team attempting to smuggle out a former army colonel, František Žižek, was ambushed deep in the Shumava after using a signal system, 3 quick flashes of a shuttered torch, that had been safe during World War II. But this time, the responding signal was a trap. Witnesses who later escaped described hidden field phones and Soviet-style search tactics, encirclement, sudden illumination with flood lamps, and methodical sweep lines. These were techniques the Soviets had perfected during anti-partisan operations against the UPA and Home Army in the war's final phase. Modern reflection suggests the CIA underestimated how effectively the STB absorbed Soviet wartime counterintelligence doctrine. Where the OSS and SOE had used flexible cell structures during World War II, the STB mirrored those methods with a heavier hand, infiltrating communities, creating false resistance groups, and turning captured operatives into controlled assets. One CIA officer later wrote, "We thought the war had taught us the art of shadows. The Soviets taught their protégés the science." By late 1949, the pattern became unmistakable. Couriers were disappearing not at random, but along specific routes, often at moments that suggested prearranged ambushes. STB archives released after 1989 confirmed that the agency received detailed intelligence about certain CIA-supported activities, information too precise to have come from patrols alone. Partial files point to at least one high-ranking defector within the exile networks in Bavaria, though the identity of this individual remains unknown. The chapter closes with lingering uncertainty. Several safe houses, once used by both WWII partisans and the early CIA, were found abandoned, their contents intact, as if their occupants vanished mid-preparation. Radios were left tuned but silent. Food still sat on tables. The STB reported no raids in those locations for the dates in question. To this day, no definitive explanation exists for these disappearances, leaving historians to debate whether the couriers fell victim to betrayal, Soviet interception, or simply vanished into the same forests that once sheltered them during the war.
Ahead lies an even more dangerous theater, Poland, where post-war resistance movements fought the Soviets with World War II-era bravery, and where CIA efforts would be met with some of the most sophisticated infiltration of the early Cold War. Few chapters of early Cold War espionage are as steeped in danger and ambiguity as the CIA's operations in post-war Poland. One haunting truth stands out. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, Poland's cursed soldiers, the remnants of the wartime Armia Krajowa, Home Army, mounted one of Europe's last armed resistances against Soviet domination. And it was into this hostile, tightly controlled environment that the CIA attempted to insert operatives, revive wartime contacts, and build networks capable of undermining Soviet rule. The results were devastating. Safe houses compromised within hours, couriers captured before reaching drop points, and entire cells disappearing after seemingly secure meetings. To this day, fragments of these cases lie scattered across Polish and American archives, their stories marked by courage, betrayal, and unanswered questions. The struggle began with the Home Army's tragic fate after World War II. Having fought the Germans in some of the conflict's most brutal resistance operations, from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to the 1944 Warsaw Citywide Revolt, the AK expected recognition and autonomy in a post-Nazi Poland. Instead, they were immediately targeted by the Soviet NKVD and the new Polish secret police, the UB, Urząd Bezpieczeństwa. Former Allied intelligence partners now found themselves hunted by the forces that claimed to have liberated them. The CIA, inheriting OSS contacts and wartime ties with AK officers, sought to support the surviving networks, but the battlefield had changed. Unlike the chaotic wartime conditions that allowed partisans to operate with agility, post-war Poland was a surveillance state in the making. One key insight comes from a 1947 letter written by an AK commander in hiding, known only by his nom de guerre, Jastrab. Smuggled to the Americans in West Berlin, he warned, "Do not trust the silence. They watched the roads we walked during the war. They know our old habits." His words proved prophetic. The CIA initially relied on AK escapees familiar with wartime courier lines, routes through forests near Lublin, through the Tatras into Czechoslovakia, or via the marshes around Białystok. But the UB had studied these same wartime networks meticulously. They reactivated old German surveillance posts, repurposed watchtowers, and used interrogation records looted from former Gestapo offices. The first major reveal came during Operation Rixen, an early CIA attempt to reactivate a cluster of AK cells near Krakow. The CIA believed the area's dense forests and established partisan history would offer concealment. Yet, within days of first contact, meeting locations were raided with precision. One American-trained courier, known under the alias Leon, reported that the UB arrived at a safe house less than an hour after he had departed. This speed indicated more than routine patrols. It suggested real-time intelligence. A later analysis found that one of the safe houses had been under quiet UB surveillance for months, its owner interrogated and released under unknown conditions. Another case, Operation Pliers, focused on smuggling out a high-value target, a former AK intelligence officer named Captain Zygmunt Witcher Lewandowski. The plan mirrored wartime extraction tactics, coordinated signals, forest rendezvous, and layered fallback routes. But the mission collapsed when UB agents, disguised as local farmers, intercepted the extraction team before they reached the meeting point.
Survivors later described UB tactics that bore the hallmarks of Soviet instruction: silent encirclement, hidden overwatch positions, and interrogation techniques identical to those used by the NKVD in eastern Poland during the war.
Captain Lewandowski vanished into the UB prison system. His fate remains unconfirmed, though fragments of a prisoner ledger from the infamous Mokotów prison include an entry marked only with the initials ZL and the note, Priority Detainee.
Modern reflection reveals that the CIA underestimated the depth of Soviet penetration into Polish exile groups. The UB had infiltrated multiple emigration centers in West Germany, mapping personal networks and passing critical names to their Soviet advisors. Many CIA officers, trained on World War II OSS doctrines, assumed partisanship and secrecy could be revived through courage and ingenuity. But the Soviets had spent the war dismantling resistance movements, using systematic, data-driven counterinsurgency, methods far beyond anything the Germans had deployed in occupied Poland. By 1950, CIA analysts began to notice disturbing patterns. Meeting points were being compromised in a manner too consistent to be coincidence. Messages delivered through supposedly secure couriers were showing up in UB interrogation archives. In a memo later declassified, a CIA station chief wrote, "We are fighting ghosts. Every door we knock on, someone else has already opened." The document hinted at a suspected mole, either within the exile networks or the early ranks of CIA field officers, but no name was ever conclusively identified. The chapter ends in a cloud of tension and unanswered questions. Entire cells of former Home Army members vanished during attempted extractions. Some were confirmed executed. Others simply disappeared into the labyrinth of UB prisons, their paper trails abruptly ending. Decades later, Polish archives provided partial insights, but many files remain missing or altered. For historians, the pattern suggests a mix of betrayal, intercepted communications, and a formidable Soviet-trained security apparatus that adapted World War II counter-resistance strategies with chilling efficiency. The next chapter moves north, towards the final layer of this intelligence puzzle, where missing agents, destroyed records, and contradictory testimonies would force the CIA to question the very foundation of its early Cold War operations. By the mid-1950s, the CIA faced a sobering reality. Nearly a decade of covert activity in Eastern Europe had produced more unanswered questions than successes. A little-known fact underscores the gravity of this moment in intelligence history. Between 1946 and 1955, the CIA recorded more missing personnel and compromised networks in Eastern Europe than in any other theater of the emerging Cold War. Many of these losses shared eerie similarities: abrupt radio silence, records destroyed or altered, and conflicting testimonies from survivors. The agency, born from the wartime OSS, was now forced to confront an unsettling truth. It was fighting an adversary that had mastered the lessons of World War II counterintelligence with ruthless efficiency. The struggle began with internal pressure. After the failures in the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland, senior CIA leadership launched a comprehensive review of all post-war operations behind Soviet lines. The review, initiated under Deputy Director Frank Wisner, aimed to determine why so many missions had ended abruptly with little or no trace of the operatives involved. The investigation quickly revealed a pattern. The majority of missions were built on World War II assumptions: reliance on partisan networks, fragmented cell structures, and secure radio transmissions, all of which the Soviet security apparatus had spent the war studying, infiltrating, and ultimately weaponizing. One insight from the period comes from a 1955 internal report titled "Reflections on Recent Operational Outcomes in the Eastern Bloc." Drawing upon lessons from interrogations of defectors, field interviews, and declassified Soviet wartime counterinsurgency manuals,
The authors concluded that the KGB and its partner services had developed a near-total understanding of how Western clandestine operations functioned.
The report highlighted that Soviet training academies used captured OSS and SOE files as instructional material. Techniques that Allied officers once used against the Nazis, deception operations, double-agent manipulation, and controlled radio playbacks, were now being turned with devastating precision against the CIA. The reveal came when analysts re-examined radio logs from several vanished missions. They discovered unmistakable signs of Soviet radio games, transmissions crafted by captured agents under supervision, designed to keep the CIA believing the networks were still active.
This tactic was nearly identical to the German Englandspiel during World War II, when the Abwehr used captured Dutch resistance radios to lure more agents to their capture. But the Soviet version was even more refined, aided by wartime NKVD experience against the Polish Home Army, Ukrainian UPA, Baltic partisans, and other resistance groups.
The temporary alliance dissolved into competing zones of influence, mapping the origins of an enduring strategic failure. The Cold War was a clash between the CIA's improvisational map and the KGB's relentless flowchart of control. The era of fighting with memories is over. Modern intelligence demands documented files and refined strategic planning. Forbidden words passed from hand to hand, secretly typed narratives that became the fault lines in the monolithic Soviet structure. The faces of the disappeared illuminate the true cost of liberty, forever linked to the roar of the crowd marching under the triumphant banner of solidarity. Decades after the collapse, the historian finds the KGB records open, but the most crucial chapters have been deliberately ripped away. History is rewritten in black ink, a comparative look at the Soviet source material versus the intentional obfuscation of the corresponding CIA declassification. After decades, the search was finally over. The archive's iron maw had swallowed its secrets whole. The government erased his mission from history, but a family never forgets the face they lost to the Shadow War. The helmet of the front line dissolves, merging into the shadow of the fedora. The age of the warrior yields to the era of the spy. Stretching into the darkness, these silent aisles hold the forgotten truths of the world. Only the light catching the dust betrays the presence of sleeping history.